Welcome back to Verglas History. I am the archivist, and today we step into the dark to uncover the terrifying mystery of Roanoke. History is usually written by the victors. It is a ledger of conquered lands, towering monuments, and celebrated dates. But there is a different kind of history. A history written not in ink, but in absolute terrifying silence. When an entire community simply vanishes from the face of the earth, leaving behind no bodies, no graves, and no explanations, we are forced to look into the void. And often, the void looks back. To understand the nightmare of Roanoke, you must first understand the staggering arrogance of the empire that built it. It is the late 16th century. The year is 1585. The Atlantic Ocean is a chessboard of geopolitical violence, completely dominated by the unmatched naval power of the Spanish Empire. Spain has already devoured Central and South America, flooding Madrid with oceans of stolen Aztec and Incan gold. England, ruled by Queen Elizabeth I, is a small, cold, relatively poor island nation, desperate for a foothold in the New World. Sir Walter Raleigh, a charismatic and ruthlessly ambitious favorite of the Queen, is granted a royal charter. His mission is simple on paper, but nearly impossible in execution. Establish the very first permanent English settlement in North America. It would serve as a military base, a hidden fortress from which English privateers could launch devastating raids against Spanish treasure galleons sailing up the coast. Raleigh does not go himself. He funds and organizes a massive military expedition commanded by Sir Richard Grenville and a seasoned soldier named Ralph Lane. They command a fleet of 7 ships, carrying roughly 600 men. These are not farmers or families or diplomats. They are hardened veterans of European wars, mercenaries, and aristocrats. When they finally cross the brutal Atlantic and reach the coastline of what is now North Carolina, they do not find the welcoming, fertile paradise they were promised in London. They sail into the Outer Banks. It is a treacherous, shifting barrier of sandbars and shallow shoals that maritime historians now call the graveyard of the Atlantic. Almost immediately, their flagship, the Tiger, strikes a hidden sandbank. The hull is violently breached. Seawater floods the lower decks, instantly ruining the vast majority of their vital food supplies and seeds before they even set foot on solid ground. It is a dark omen, but the English are undeterred. They make their way to a small, heavily forested island nestled behind the barrier reef. The local indigenous tribes call it Roanoke. The physical reality of the New World is a profound psychological shock to the English soldiers. They have arrived in the suffocating, humid heat of the American southern summer. They are dressed in heavy wool, tight leather collars, and thick steel breastplates. They are entirely unequipped to survive in this labyrinth of mosquito-infested swamps, dense pine forests, and suffocating humidity. But their greatest miscalculation is not environmental. It is cultural. The English believe they are stepping into a primitive wilderness that will simply bow to their inherent superiority. They expect the local indigenous population, the Socotan people, to recognize them as natural masters and happily provide them with food, labor, and resources. Initially, the Socotan are cautious but hospitable. They have complex societies, deeply rooted agricultural traditions, and a delicate political balance. They offer the strange, pale men in metal suits corn, fish, and guidance. They view the English as potential military allies against rival tribes. But the English military mindset is rigid, paranoid, and fundamentally incapable of respect. Ralph Lane and his officers treat the Secautan not as sovereign equals, but as subjects to be managed. The tension slowly builds in the sweltering heat as the English, having ruined their own supplies, begin to relentlessly demand more and more food from the indigenous winter reserves. And then, the fragility of the entire colonial project is exposed by a single, utterly insignificant object. During a brief expedition to the mainland, the English visit a Secautan village named Aquascogok. After leaving the village and returning to their boats, one of the English commanders realizes that a small, silver drinking cup is missing from his personal belongings. He immediately assumes that a native villager has stolen it. There is no investigation. There is no diplomatic inquiry. There is no consideration of the fact that the cup might have simply been dropped in the mud. For the English, a missing silver cup is not a minor theft. It is an insult to the crown. It is a challenge to their absolute authority. Sir Richard Grenville orders a detachment of heavily armed soldiers to return to the village. They do not go to search. They go to make a terrifying example. The soldiers march into Aquascogok. Without a word of negotiation, they light their torches. They burn the wooden homes to the ground. They smash the pottery. But far more devastating than the destruction of the homes, the English systematically burn the village's carefully cultivated cornfields. In the brutal mathematics of survival in the wilderness, burning a harvest is not merely vandalism. It is a death sentence. It is an act of total war. The English turn their backs on the smoking ruins of the village, completely satisfied that they have asserted their dominance. They have no idea that they have just signed their own death warrant. They have taken the only people on the continent who could teach them how to survive, and turned them into blood enemies. Shortly after the burning of the village, Sir Richard Grenville sails back to England to secure more supplies, leaving Ralph Lane and just over 100 men behind on Roanoke to hold the fort. For a year, the garrison descends into a living hell. They are starving. They are surrounded by hostile tribes who have rightly decided to cut off all food supplies. The English are reduced to eating their own hunting dogs. They are trapped behind their wooden palisades, staring out into the dark tree line, waiting for arrows to fly out of the shadows. In the summer of 1586, Sir Francis Drake, returning from a massive raiding expedition in the Caribbean, stops at Roanoke. He finds the colonists starving, desperate, and broken. They beg him to take them home. Drake agrees. The men abandon their fort, board Drake's ships, and flee back across the Atlantic. They leave in such a panicked rush that 3 English soldiers, who had gone further inland to explore, are completely left behind. They are never seen again. But the tragedy of the first colony does not end there. Just weeks after Drake sails away, Sir Richard Grenville finally returns from England with ships heavily laden with food, weapons, and supplies. He sails into the bay, expecting to find Ralph Lane's garrison. Instead, he finds an empty, silent fort. The gates are open. The barracks are abandoned. Grenville is confused and frustrated. He refuses to abandon the mission entirely, so he makes a decision that seals the fate of a handful of men. He selects 15 soldiers from his crew. He orders them to stay on the island, to guard the empty fort, and to maintain the English claim to the land until a proper colony can be established. Grenville leaves them with 2 years' worth of supplies, boards his ship, and sails back to Europe. Imagine the sheer, suffocating terror of those 15 men. As the white sails of Grenville's fleet slowly disappear over the eastern horizon, they are left standing on the sandy shores of an alien world. They are completely alone. 15 men, standing in an empty wooden fort on the edge of a vast, dark, unmapped continent, surrounded by native warriors who remember exactly what the English did to their villages. The winter is coming, and the dark woods are watching. The year is 1587. 2 years have passed since the first disastrous military expedition left a trail of burned villages and bad blood on the shores of North America. Back in London, the architects of the empire realize that mercenaries and aristocrats cannot build a sustainable colony. A true empire requires families. It requires farmers, carpenters, and women. It requires people who have no intention of ever returning home. A new expedition is formed, and it is fundamentally different from the first. It is entirely civilian. There are 117 people on the manifest. Among them are 17 women and 11 children. The man chosen to lead them is not a hardened military veteran, but an artist. His name is John White. He had been on the previous voyage, serving as a painter and mapmaker. White is a dreamer. He believes in the utopian vision of the New World. He believes in this mission so deeply that he brings his own pregnant daughter, Eleanor, and his son-in-law, Ananias Dare. The plan approved by Sir Walter Raleigh is clear and logical. They are explicitly ordered to avoid Roanoke Island at all costs. The native tribes there have been brutalized, and the area is far too dangerous. Instead, they are to sail further north to the deep, protected waters of the Chesapeake Bay to establish the city of Raleigh. It is a good plan, a survivable plan. But history is rarely shaped by good plans. It is shaped by greed, and it is shaped by betrayal. The fleet is navigated by a seasoned, ruthless Portuguese pilot named Simón Fernandes. Fernandes is technically working for the English crown, but his true loyalty lies with his own purse. He is a privateer, a state-sanctioned pirate. His only real interest is hunting heavily armed Spanish treasure galleons in the Caribbean. Transporting 100 seasick civilians is, to him, a miserable waste of time. The crossing of the Atlantic is a nightmare. Fernandes deliberately takes dangerous routes. He refuses to stop for fresh water at safe islands, prioritizing speed over the health of the passengers. Tensions on the cramped, rotting wooden decks of the flagship, the Lion, threaten to boil over into mutiny. John White and Simon Fernandes despise each other, engaging in screaming matches in the captain's quarters as the civilians suffer below deck. In late July of 1587, the fleet finally reaches the treacherous coastline of the Outer Banks. They anchor off the coast of Roanoke Island. The agreement is that they will only stop here for a few hours. John White intends to take a small scouting party ashore to check on the 15 soldiers that Sir Richard Grenville had left behind the previous year, and then they will immediately sail north to the Chesapeake. White and his scouts climb into the small rowboats. But as they begin to pull away from the flagship, Simon Fernandes stands at the rail and delivers a death sentence. He shouts down to the rowboats that the summer is too far gone. He claims he cannot risk navigating his ships into the unknown waters of the Chesapeake this late in the season. He orders the sailors manning the rowboats to dump the colonists on the beach. He tells John White that this is the end of the line. Roanoke is their new home, whether they like it or not. Fernandez will unload their supplies and leave. He is taking the ships, and he is going hunting for Spanish gold. John White, the artist, the grandfather, is powerless. He has no military authority to force the seasoned pilot to obey. From the small wooden boats bobbing in the surf, White watches in absolute horror as his entire world collapses. Over the next few days, 117 men, women, and children are ferried from the ships and unceremoniously dumped on the blazing hot, mosquito-infested sands of Roanoke Island. They are wearing heavy Elizabethan clothing. The children are crying. The heat is suffocating. But at the very least, they have a destination. John White rallies his terrified people. He tells them about the fort built by the first expedition. He assures them that Grenville's 15 men will be there to welcome them. They have a wooden palisade. They have shelter. The colonists form a long, nervous column and begin the march inland toward the northern end of the island. The American forest in the summer of 1587 is completely alien to these urban English civilians. The trees are monstrously tall. The underbrush is an impenetrable wall of thorns and vines. The air is thick, humid, and vibrating with the deafening hum of cicadas. Every snapping twig sounds like a gunshot. They feel the eyes of the forest upon them. They know what the English did to the local tribes just 2 years prior. They know they are walking through hostile territory. Finally, they reach the clearing where the fort was built. John White steps forward, calling out to the 15 soldiers, but there is no answer. There is only the wind rustling through the pines. As the colonists carefully approach the gates, the grim reality of their situation begins to set in. The fort has not been maintained. The heavy wooden palisades have been torn down in several places. The sturdy brick houses built by the first expedition are completely overgrown with thick green vines. Wild melons are growing through the floorboards of the barracks. The wilderness has already begun to digest the English architecture. It is a ghost town. The 15 men left behind by Grenville are nowhere to be found. And then a colonist makes a discovery in the tall grass near the edge of the woods. It is a human skeleton. The bones have been picked completely clean by scavengers and bleached white by the relentless summer sun. It is all that remains of one of the 15 English soldiers. A wave of paralyzing panic washes over the civilians. Pregnant women, elderly men, and small children stand in the ruins of the fort, staring at the bones of a trained military veteran. They realize, with absolute clarity, that they have not been dropped off at a sanctuary. They have been abandoned in an abattoir. The 15 soldiers were either slaughtered here, or they fled into the wilderness and were hunted down. As the sun begins to set over the Carolina coast, plunging the dense forest into an impenetrable, terrifying darkness, the colonists of Roanoke realize they are completely trapped. Simon, Fernandez, and the ships are leaving. The indigenous tribes surrounding them have a deep, justified hatred for the English. And all that stands between 117 civilians and the wrath of an entire continent is a ruined wooden wall. Fear is a remarkable architect. In the immediate aftermath of discovering the bleached skeleton of the English soldier, the paralyzing panic of the colonists morphs into a frantic, desperate energy. They realize that Simon Fernandez and the fleet will soon weigh anchor and vanish over the horizon, leaving them entirely cut off from the known universe. They work from dawn until dusk in the suffocating coastal heat. Men who were tailors, merchants, and gentlemen back in London blister their hands swinging heavy iron axes. They fell the massive Carolina pines, sharpen the trunks, and drag them into place to repair the broken gaps in the wooden palisade. They clear the overgrowth from the ruined brick houses. But a wooden wall is only a psychological comfort. It is an illusion of control. The forest surrounding the fort is vast, ancient, and completely impenetrable. The colonists feel the weight of unseen eyes upon them at all hours. They are 117 strangers dropped into a completely alien ecosystem, and they are surrounded by indigenous nations who have every right to despise them. For the first few days, the colonists stay close to the fort. They are terrified of the dark tree line, but hunger and the monotonous reality of survival begin to dull their paranoia. They need to eat. They need to gather resources. On August 8th, just over 2 weeks after arriving on the island, a colonist named George Howe decides he has had enough of the cramped, terrified atmosphere inside the palisade. He is an ordinary man, simply wanting a brief moment of quiet and a fresh meal. Without an armed escort, he wanders out of the fort and heads down to the shallow waters of the Sound, hoping to catch crabs. He wades into the warm, murky water. He is focused on the sandy bottom, holding a small forked stick. He is completely isolated, stripping away his heavy European clothes to tolerate the heat. He never hears them coming. From the tall reeds of the marsh, a hunting party emerges. They are warriors from the mainland, likely belonging to the Croatoan or the Wanchese, tribes whose villages and crops were burned to ash by the English military 2 years prior. They do not simply kill George Howe. They make a terrifying, deliberate statement. When the colonists eventually realize Howe is missing and send a search party, they find his body floating in the shallow reeds. It is a gruesome, horrifying sight. Howe's corpse is riddled with 16 indigenous arrows. But the arrows were not enough. The warriors had waded into the water and systematically pulverized his skull with heavy wooden clubs. This was not a skirmish. This was an execution. It was a message written in blood, delivered to the doorstep of the colony. The mutilated body of George Howe shatters whatever fragile morale the colonists had managed to build. The horrific reality of their situation crashes down upon them. They are not brave pioneers conquering a new frontier. They are prey. They are trapped in a wooden cage, and the continent is actively trying to digest them. The panic inside the fort reaches a fever pitch. Women are weeping in the dark. The men sleep with their muskets loaded, jumping at every snap of a twig in the woods. And yet, in the very center of this nightmare, life stubbornly refuses to submit to death. Just 10 days after the mutilated body of George Howe is dragged back to the fort, the colony experiences a moment of profound, heartbreaking contrast. On August 18th, 1587, Eleanor Dare, the daughter of the colony's governor, John White, goes into labor. In a sweltering, cramped, dimly lit room behind the wooden palisades, surrounded by terrified people and thousands of miles of hostile wilderness, Eleanor gives birth to a healthy baby girl. They name her Virginia. Virginia Dare is the first English child born in the Americas. In any other circumstance, this would be a moment of monumental historical triumph. It would be a day of feasting and celebration. But on Roanoke, the birth of this child is a heavy, crushing psychological burden. When John White holds his newborn granddaughter, he does not see the bright future of an empire. He looks down at this tiny, fragile, helpless creature, and then he looks up at the dark, looming trees beyond the walls. He knows that they barely have enough food to last the winter. He knows that thousands of angry warriors stand between them and any hope of salvation. He is holding his granddaughter in a graveyard. The birth of Virginia changes the calculus of the entire colony. The adults realize that their utopian dream is dead. This is no longer an expedition of discovery. It is a hostage situation. As the end of August approaches, Simon Fernandez finally prepares to set sail for England. The colonists convene a frantic, desperate assembly. They do the brutal math of their survival. The supplies ruined during the Atlantic crossing, combined with the absolute refusal of the local tribes to trade for food, means they will starve to death long before the spring. They need help. They need heavy military support, tons of food, and fresh supplies from London. The colonists turn to John White. They beg him, their governor, to get on Fernandez's ship and return to England to personally plead their case to Queen Elizabeth and Sir Walter Raleigh. Initially, White violently refuses. He is terrified that if he leaves, the colonists will turn on his family, or that his reputation will be ruined in London, branded as a coward who abandoned his own people in their darkest hour. But the colonists are relentless. They draft a formal, signed document, legally demanding that he go as their sole representative. They leave him absolutely no choice. On August 27th, 1587, John White stands on the sandy shores of Roanoke. The small rowboat is waiting to take him to the flagship. He turns to look at his daughter, Eleanor. She is holding 9-day-old Virginia in her arms. He embraces them, promising on his life that he will return as quickly as the winds will carry him. He promises them ships filled with food, soldiers, and salvation. John White climbs into the rowboat. As the sailors pull at the oars, he watches his family grow smaller and smaller on the shoreline, until they are nothing but tiny, fragile specks against the overwhelming, suffocating green of the American continent. He does not know that this is the last time he will ever see them. Forgive the interruption. I am the archivist. If you find yourself captivated by the dark, forgotten corners of our past, I ask that you leave a like on this video. It is a small gesture, but it signals the algorithm and helps me bring these buried records to others who seek them. And if you wish to ensure you never miss our next descent into the shadows, please subscribe to Verglas History and ring the bell. The archives are vast, the corridors are dark, and you will not want to walk through them alone. Now, let us return to the nightmare of Roanoke. There is a specific kind of psychological torture that belongs only to the helpless. It is the agonizing, suffocating reality of watching a tragedy unfold in slow motion, knowing that you possess absolutely no power to stop it. For John White, this torture did not last for hours or days. It lasted for 3 agonizing years. The journey back across the Atlantic in the autumn of 1587 is a brutal, miserable affair. The winds are uncooperative. The ocean is violent. John White is forced to endure weeks of seasickness and isolation in the dark hull of the ship, his mind frantically calculating how much food the colonists have left in the ruined fort of Roanoke. When he finally sets foot on English soil in Cornwall, it is early November. He immediately rides for London, carrying the desperate pleas of 117 people. He is ready to beg Queen Elizabeth and Sir Walter Raleigh for a fleet of ships, for heavily armed soldiers, and for tons of grain and salted meat. But when John White arrives in London, he steps into a country that is holding its breath, preparing for the apocalypse. The geopolitical landscape of Europe has fundamentally shifted while White was across the ocean. King Philip II of Spain, the most powerful monarch on the planet, has finally lost his patience with English pirates raiding his treasure fleets. He is no longer interested in skirmishes. He has decided to crush the English crown entirely. Spain is assembling the Invincible Armada. It is the largest, most heavily armed naval invasion force the world has ever seen. The Spanish intend to sail up the English Channel, land a massive army on the beaches, march on London, and execute Queen Elizabeth. England is facing total, existential annihilation. When John White presents his frantic petition to save the Roanoke colony, he is met with a cold, terrifying reality. The survival of 117 civilians freezing in the American mud is suddenly utterly insignificant compared to the survival of the entire English nation. Queen Elizabeth issues a devastating royal decree: a total stay of shipping. Every single vessel in the country, from massive warships down to small merchant caravels, is immediately requisitioned by the Crown. Every able-bodied sailor, every ounce of gunpowder, and every scrap of canvas is drafted for the defense of the island. Absolutely nothing is permitted to leave English waters. John White is completely trapped. He is a prisoner in his own capital. He frantically leverages every political connection he has. He begs Sir Walter Raleigh for help. Raleigh, recognizing the desperate situation, manages to pull incredible strings. In April of 1588, Raleigh secures two small, poorly armed pinnaces, the Brave and the Roe. It is not the massive relief fleet White wanted, but it is enough to carry emergency food and supplies to his daughter and granddaughter. The two small ships slip out of the English port, defying the odds. White stands on the deck, finally feeling a surge of hope. But the curse of Roanoke is absolute. The captains of these two small vessels are not interested in a humanitarian rescue mission. They are privateers, infected with the greed of the era. Instead of sailing directly across the Atlantic to save the starving colonists, the captains decide to play pirate. They hunt down smaller French and Scottish merchant ships, hoping to steal their cargo and make a quick profit before heading to America. It is a catastrophic miscalculation. They engage a heavily armed French privateer. The French ship completely outguns them. The English vessels are violently boarded. Hand-to-hand combat erupts on the decks. John White, an artist and a grandfather, is severely wounded in the fighting, shot in the head and slashed with a pike. The French pirates strip the English ships of absolutely everything. They steal the weapons, the navigation equipment, and worst of all, they steal every single ounce of the food and supplies meant for the starving men, women, and children of Roanoke. Bleeding, humiliated, and utterly defeated, White and the crew are forced to limp their broken ships back to England. It is the death blow to his hopes. The Spanish Armada is now entering the English Channel. The war has begun. The ports are sealed shut. There will be no more exceptions. There will be no more rescue missions. For the next 2 years, John White experiences a living hell. Imagine his psychological state. He is living in the safety of London. He has a warm bed. He has food on his table. But every time the wind howls against his window glass, he knows it is winter in America. He does the horrific math in his head every single night. He left them in August of 1587. They only had enough supplies to last a few months. When the winter of 1588 arrives, he knows the food is gone. He imagines the indigenous tribes closing in on the ruined wooden palisade. He imagines the freezing rain. He imagines his daughter, Eleanor, watching her baby starve to death, looking out at the empty gray ocean, wondering why her father lied to her, wondering why he abandoned them. The English eventually defeat the Spanish Armada in a miraculous, historic naval victory. The streets of London erupt in celebration. Church bells ring across the country. The empire is saved. But for John White, the victory tastes like ash. The political bureaucracy is incredibly slow to release the stay of shipping. The year 1588 turns into 1589. 1589 slowly grinds into 1590. 3 full years pass, 3 years of absolute silence from across the ocean. By the time John White finally secures passage on a privateering fleet commanded by John Watts in the spring of 1590, he is a broken man. He is no longer sailing to America to resupply a thriving colony. In his heart, he knows the grim reality of the wilderness. He is not sailing as a governor. He is sailing as an undertaker. He is crossing 3,000 miles of violent ocean, entirely consumed by the desperate, terrifying need to know how his family died. A brief whisper in the dark before we face the end. If you are still with me, if you have survived this journey through the cold and the quiet, and you are still listening to this record, leave a comment below with the words, "The woods are watching." I will leave a heart on every single one of those comments. It is a small comfort to know that I am not walking through these dark archives alone. Now, let us step onto the shores of Roanoke for the final time. It is August 15th, 1590. 3 years, almost to the day, since John White left his family on the shores of North America. The privateering fleet anchors off of the treacherous coast of the Outer Banks. It is late in the evening, as John White stands on the deck of the flagship, staring out into the pitch-black void of the continent. He sees something that makes his heart race. Through the darkness, rising from the dense forests of Roanoke Island, he sees the distinct, flickering orange glow of a fire. And then another. For a man who has spent 3 years imagining nothing but death, the sight of fire is an overwhelming surge of hope. Fire means warmth. Fire means survival. Fire means people. He convinces himself that they made it. He convinces himself that against all impossible odds, Eleanor and Virginia are sitting around that fire, waiting for him. The next morning, White and a heavily armed search party climb into two rowboats and begin the tortuous journey through the shallow inlet toward the island. Before they even reach the shore, a massive column of thick black smoke rises into the sky, further inland. White orders the men to row faster. As they approach the northern end of the island, where the colony was built, they sound trumpets. They sing familiar English folk songs at the top of their lungs, hoping the familiar tunes will drift through the trees and draw the colonists out of the woods. But there is no answer. The music is simply swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the pines. They drag the rowboats onto the sand and step ashore. They march toward the clearing. What John White finds when he reaches the site of the colony is infinitely more terrifying than a battlefield. If he had found a massacre, if he had found burned buildings and scattered bones, it would have been horrific, but it would have been an answer. A massacre makes logical sense in a brutal world. Instead, he finds absolute clinical emptiness. The colony has not been destroyed. It has been methodically and carefully dismantled. The heavy brick houses have been taken down. The wooden structures are gone. The area has been enclosed by a massive, high palisade constructed from heavy tree trunks, built much like a defensive fort. But the gates are open. The fort is empty. There are no bodies. There is no blood. There are no signs of a desperate struggle or a sudden raid. Grass and weeds are already growing through the sandy floor of the enclosure, indicating that the area has been completely abandoned for a very long time. As White frantically searches the perimeter, his eyes fall upon a massive wooden post at the right side of the entrance gate. The bark has been carefully stripped away, and carved deep into the raw wood, in clear capitalized Roman letters, is a single word: Croatoan. Before John White had left 3 years ago, he had established a strict emergency protocol with the colonists. If they were forced to flee the island, they were to carve their destination into a tree or a doorpost. But more importantly, if they were forced to flee under attack or in absolute distress, they were ordered to carve a Maltese cross above the destination. White stares at the post. He runs his fingers over the carved letters. There is no cross. A little further away, on another tree near the sandy bank, he finds the letters C-R-O carved into the bark. Again, there is no cross of distress. Croatoan was the name of a nearby island, roughly 50 miles to the south. It was the home of a friendly indigenous tribe that had traded with the English in the past. White desperately tries to convince himself that this is good news. The lack of a distress signal means they left peacefully. They packed up the heavy equipment, dismantled the houses, and moved to Croatoan to live with the natives. They must be waiting for him there. He orders the men to search the surrounding area. Deep in a trench, heavily overgrown with weeds, they find a heartbreaking discovery. They uncover heavy iron cannons, metal bars, and 5 large wooden chests. The chests have been brutally smashed open, completely ruined by the weather and scavengers. White recognizes them immediately. They are his own personal chests. They hold his maps, his frames, his armor, and his books. Everything he had left behind 3 years ago has been destroyed. The visual of his ruined artwork rotting in the mud is the final crushing blow. The reality of the situation settles over him like a cold shroud. White immediately runs back to the captain of the fleet. He begs him to weigh anchor and sail 50 miles south to Croatoan Island. He needs to find them. He is so close. But the American wilderness has one final, devastating trick to play. As the English ships prepare to sail south, the sky turns the color of bruised iron. A massive, violent hurricane violently sweeps in from the Atlantic. The winds scream with unimaginable ferocity. The shallow, treacherous waters of the Outer Banks turn into a boiling cauldron. The flagship's heavy anchor cables snap like brittle twine. The ships are violently thrown around, nearly smashing into the hidden sandbars. The captain of the fleet looks at the churning nightmare of the ocean and makes a cold, mathematical decision. They have lost their anchors. They are losing their fresh water. The hurricane will tear them to pieces if they stay. He orders the fleet to turn eastward. They are abandoning the search. They are sailing back to Europe. John White stands on the deck, gripping the wet wooden rail as the violent winds tear at his clothes. He looks back through the blinding rain, watching the dark outline of the American coast slowly fade into the gray abyss. He is utterly powerless. The ocean and the storm have formed an impenetrable wall between him and his family. John White will return to Ireland, where he will live out his final years in quiet, absolute obscurity, haunted every single night by the silence of the woods. He will never know what happened to his daughter. He will never know the fate of little Virginia. For over 400 years, historians, archaeologists, and scientists have searched for the lost colony. They have dug through the dirt, analyzed tree rings, and sifted through indigenous folklore. Some believe the colonists were slaughtered by the powerful Powhatan Empire further inland. Some believe they were captured by Spanish patrols and thrown into the sea, and some believe they simply walked into the forest, intermarried with the Croatoan tribe, and slowly dissolved into the indigenous population, their blue eyes and English words echoing faintly through the generations. But the truth remains buried in the soil. History is full of ghosts, and there are many more records waiting in the dark. If you found value in today's journey into the unknown, please leave a like and subscribe to Verglas History. It is a vital signal that these forgotten stories still matter, and it ensures you will not miss our next descent into the archives. I am the archivist. Thank you for watching, and until next time, beware the silence.